All right, so we're here to update you on our perimeter buffer work, and Mr. Robertson and Mr. Whitehouse joining me to assist in our presentation, which collectively we are guiding ourselves and you all through this update. I did give you a copy of the presentation at your desk, and we will follow along here on the screen. So what we have done, recall going all the way back to the workshop and even prior to that, identifying the perimeter buffer as a topic that we'd like to update in county code. And from the workshop, perimeter buffer was ranked among County Council and Planning and Zoning Commission as the first initiative for us to tackle. So here we are. And what we've done is develop an outline of topics that we're going to review. And you'll see this outline has some specifics, but not a lot of specifics, because we're working our way methodically through this to get your feedback before we get to the point of writing an ordinance. So I see this as almost a three-step process. Start with an outline, then we'll get a little more meat on the specifics of what the next document will look like, get your feedback and approval to move into the ordinance writing. Because this topic is somewhat complicated, we wanted to not run before we walk and make sure we have an understanding of your support for some of the ideas that we have. So to develop this outline, we did some research on local jurisdictions and what they do related to buffers and buffers that utilize woodlands. And like I said, after today, we will take your feedback and move towards the next step. Hoping to put that next step in front of you in the next month or so, and then we would move into ordinance after that. So the outline we're going to present has 7 topics broken down by theme, which kind of keeps it compartmentalized and easy, hopefully, to follow. As I mentioned before, this was our first initiative for us to tackle, and after we go through this, we want your feedback, and hopefully we'll hear from you today on some of these ideas. Okay, so Section 1, definitions. We took specific terms of art that are in today's code or will be in the future updated code, and we provided definitions for these. I will note, these are not the definitions that appear in your outline or PowerPoint. These are just the topics: forest assessment, perimeter buffer landscape plan, perimeter buffer protection area, and woodlands, that in a future document will be specifically defined, because those are terms of art that will appear in the future ordinance. I would note, in the perimeter buffer, today's code calls for a 30-foot perimeter buffer. We have not changed that. That is one question mark of hearing from you all. Is 30 feet enough?
And just to clarify that, it's 30 feet in a cluster subdivision, which is virtually every subdivision we see anymore. The old standard subdivision is 20. One of the things we talked about early on was just standardizing that to make it 30 throughout.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So the question we had, as Todd said, was whether you think 30 is the right measurement.
But we're buffering the buffer now, right? If we go this route. So
yeah.
In other words, we're hopefully preserving the trees that are in the buffer.
Yes.
Excellent segue. Hold that thought. We'll bring that up in the idea that we present to you. One thing that we want to keep in mind is what is the function of these buffers? The buffers are really just a natural screen, right? It's better than a white fence. And if there are trees in place, perhaps we can use them to screen the neighboring property. But this doesn't really qualify as water quality, maybe a little bit of habitat for nature, but not to the point of what we're talking of acres and acres of woods. This perimeter buffer is really just a screening of the neighboring property. And the question for us as we develop this is 30 feet enough to screen the neighboring property?
Well, there's more than just screening involved with it, though, because, for example, we had probably something less than 2 inches of rain where I live, and east of us probably a little bit less than that. But yet, I saw photos on Driscoll drones over the weekend where there was so much water. I think it was at Brentwood, it used to be Coral Lakes. There's so much water standing because they've clear cut that property, and they did leave a wooded buffer, but there was so much water accumulation that the water was streaming onto their neighbor's property, and the trees, which had never been exposed to high winds before, suddenly now are, and are not strong enough because they didn't grow in an appropriate way, and we had large branches breaking off and damaging other trees. So the buffer does more than just provide a visual separation for aesthetic purposes. And so therefore, maybe the question of is it enough is a good one.
It is, for all the points you raise, and certainly that scenario with the rain in the subdivision.
Less than two inches of rain it's a lot, but it's not unusual. And, they had 4 inches, I think, in Harrington. Mm-hmm. So we could have had 4. Mm-hmm.
So questions as we walk through this to consider and think about what we showed at the workshop, maybe even go out and look at what 30-foot looks like in real life as it relates to existing and planted buffers, and if that's enough between subdivisions or other uses. Certainly, I know you're hearing from your constituents about their opinions on whether 30 feet is enough. We as staff stuck with 30 because that's what we have. And unless we hear differently, going larger or smaller, we're going to stay at 30 until we hear differently from you, okay? So next section is the perimeter buffer standards. What do you want to see inside the standards when these buffers are developed? And again, the current ordinance doesn't go into this specificity. That's one of the problems or issues we hope to address in the rewrite or the update, and making sure that we have things that specifically lay out what you want to see inside these buffers. So Section 2 defines that. All trees and shrubs must be native and on a county list. To be approved list, to be determined. We have a list currently, but we need to make sure that's vetted with the Department of Ag and other agencies, and we will codify that list inside this code update. Suffice it to say, it's what we're seeing on the ground today. Planting to ANSI A300 standards, that's the industry standard on how to plant these trees. And we kept the same breakdown that you currently see, 70% and 30% and 15 trees per 100 linear feet in a perimeter buffer. That's all standard in today's code. If we want to change that, that's the feedback that we'll need to see as we work through the ordinance. And then all trees at 6 feet at height. Now, that is a change. We have different varying degrees of height in the ordinance today. In certain sections, it mentions 5 feet. We decided to standardize it to 6 feet across the board for every tree that is planted. And there is references to caliber measurements in today's code. We've taken caliber measurements out because we currently don't measure for calibers, and we don't want to have the impression that we do or that we should during future inspections.
Should we explicitly say native species?
We do, yes, and we will. We call out native species, and there's a pursuit in the state level where native species and non-native species are being reviewed closely, and non-native species are being scrutinized at the state level. We get asked a lot from Department of Agriculture if we allow certain species to be planted within subdivisions, so it's something we should prepare for. Moving down, we mentioned signage. That's something we currently recommend in approvals, but we're going to codify it in code. Something we put in the resource buffer ordinance that was approved a few years ago, where we call out the buffer on location so residents and neighbors know not to perhaps put their barbecue pit inside the buffer, like we saw some pictures at the workshop. So having ground level signage in place that defines where the buffer is for the residents.
Question on would this present any difficulties for the developer when they're trying to create the water runoff to head towards the retention pond? I mean, is there that possibility that we're going to be creating a roadblock for them and making it much more difficult? I mean, there's two sides of this, so I want to be cognizant of that.
We believe that with this framework, I'll answer it in a couple ways. First, we want to get the engineering community's feedback on these recommendations, right? So far, what you've seen is no change to what takes place today, 30 feet, and has to, if we keep woods, we want the woods to remain. What you're getting ready to see next is a protection area where we buffer the buffers,
right,
which we heard in the workshop. If you bulldoze right up to the trees, you're going to affect the health of those trees. So we're going to buffer the buffers, and we certainly want the engineering community to look at this and see if this is possible, and impossible or a burden. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear that this is change and this is perhaps a burden. I don't want to hear that it's completely impossible, because that would certainly be not our intention to make an ordinance that's impossible to follow.
Didn't we hear at our workshop from our engineer that there are things in the DENREC code that affects this?
Yes.
Drainage, and that we can't change.
Correct. The drainage standards is state standards controlled by DENREC, which if we were to change those standards would require DENREC to open that regulation up and amend. There are folks at the state level that would like to see that happen. I'm not certain DENREC is open to that idea, but it would be up to us to ask DENREC to change those regulations and update them for greater flexibility.
And what I would say is the drainage, what it does is, if you don't have buffers, you're working drainage to the property line, right? I mean, with these buffers, what you're doing is just pulling that in to the inside of the property line. And because all these are cluster developments, you have to remember, I know you all don't see subdivisions unless it's on an appeal, but cluster subdivisions, the lots are 7,500 square feet minimum. Usually they're between 7,500 to 10,000 square feet. If you think of that in terms of acreage, if you have two 7,500 square foot lots, because it's 2 units an acre, you're only putting lots on a third of every acre in that development. So that leaves a lot of land for your roadways. The other thing is, right now, open space includes stormwater management and drainage, so there's still a lot of area that you can design around with regard to drainage and with these buffers.
It shouldn't be too burdensome. And
It'll require maybe a different design, but
Yeah,
it's, but you're doing that initial design anyway on a
Right.
development.
I mean, in my mind, it would almost make the individual lots more attractive to the potential buyer, because people like living with trees,
Yes.
Right. Well, that's good.
But you're not saying, our attorney's not saying that the engineering side of things, if DENREC chooses to not change their code, we can't do anything about that.
If DENREC
Their code is their code.
Their code is their code, that's correct.
It's going to affect what we do on property. It does today.
It does today, right.
That's not going to change. So that, I think, as Mr. Medlar referred to, that's probably where we want to start, is will they in fact open the code up and change it?
Well, I think the question is
Because
not
if they
now.
won't,
No, I
makes it
don't
more
agree,
difficult.
Mr. Vincent. I think the question is whether the DENREC code affects what we're trying to do. That's the threshold question. I think the assumption is that DENREC impacts the ability to do this, and I'm not convinced that that assumption is correct. That's something we need to
Because there's plenty of space within the subdevelopment to rearrange things, to accommodate the extra.
Now, we realize that this accommodates for it, that you're going to have outfalls. Obviously, you've got to have outfalls that go through the buffer to connect to the
Yeah, that was
overall
kind of my
regional
concern
drainage
there.
system. That's right. That's right.
And this is a great conversation, exactly what we want to hear, and a great segue into the next slide, which is how we approach this, because this talks about what we want to see in the buffers, but the key to thinking about this ordinance and the application of it is you have two scenarios. You have a piece of property that has woods on it, and we perhaps want to use those woods for the buffer and protect the woods, or you have a piece of property that has no woods whatsoever. And therefore, the DENREC drainage code is applied differently when there's no trees. There's no trees, you can, right up to the line, grade as you need to. If there are trees and you want to protect those trees, then there's a different application. So what we did is decide to walk through this in two ways: existing or non-existing woodlands on the piece of property. And you'll see this next is how we unfold the recommendations.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Where are you in protecting the existing woodlands with silt fence or some sort of barrier to prevent the root mat and the drip line from being disturbed?
It's in here, and we'll stay tuned. Your great questions. You guys are on it today. Okay, so picture helps to illustrate what our thoughts are. Recall this picture back from the workshop. This is Cardinal Grove on the right and Ocean Meadows on the left, two subdivisions right next to each other. In the example on the right, in the red box, existing woodlands that are being used as the perimeter buffer between the two subdivisions. Those woodlands are highlighted there, and we will show another picture next on what that looks like on the ground. Then, on the left, in the blue box, you could just see a very small black strip. That is your silk fence, because those two lines separate the subdivisions where they're going to plant the perimeter buffer. There was nothing there. It was a farm field, and they have to plant the buffer between the two subdivisions. So, great example in the same location of woodlands and no woodlands.
So this guy voluntarily put up the silt fence to protect the root mat. Is that?
I would say,
He wasn't required to do that.
well, silk fences are required under DENREC or SCD's permitting. So when you start going into a subdivision, the Soil Conservation District is going to require the silk fence on the outer perimeter. It just so happens that in the top right side, the silk fence is actually protecting the trees because he chose to keep the trees.
Okay, that's a property line there.
It is between the two subdivisions.
And the other thing I can't speak to this one in particular, but more recently on subdivisions, the commission has been including a fairly uniform condition that on those perimeter buffers, where there's trees that are being preserved, they have to show the tree preservation on the final site plan and also put the silt fencing on the development side of that tree buffer. So this one's new enough that probably had that condition on it from P&Z. So that's likely where that came from.
And we'll show a picture next. This is the same development. There are two silk fences in place here, looking at existing trees that are going to remain in place. If you look through the trees, you can see the orange silk fence on the other subdivision on the opposite side, both sides being protected from construction activity impacting the woods, which is something we're going to require in the future. If you're going to keep the trees, you got to protect the trees, you got to mark the trees, you got to mark the line, and you have to keep that in place so there's no accidents when it comes to protecting the buffer. Okay? So, again, the approach was, if you have existing woodlands, what do we do when there are woodlands that want to be protected? And again, we heard in the workshop, existing woodlands are preferred when they're there. They create a better shield. I think Mr. Hudson's quoted as saying, when you knock down all the trees, it takes 25 years for them to grow back. So the preferred approach, if there's woods in place, to protect those woods. So in this instance, there's existing woodlands. This is what we are recommending. Those woodlands, again, only on the perimeter buffer. If this is 200 acres of forest land, we're only talking about 30 feet. We're not talking about a forest assessment on the rest of the 200 acres. That's another ordinance, and that's a much heavier lift than what we're referencing right now, okay?
Mr. Lawson, is that where I've spoken before about someone coming in, clear cutting prior to their application, right to the property line, and then coming in with an application for a subdivision? Where are we on that?
You guys are really, all of you have had enough coffee to be very focused this morning. Stay tuned. We're going to go to a couple slides in the future.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I am very pleased to see how focused you are on this. So stay tuned. So recommended in this section when existing woodlands are in place. We're going to require a forest assessment by a certified professional. So someone goes out, surveys the perimeter, and says what's there. Then those woodlands are showed on the site plan and landscape plan for the requirements that we are talking about. They must remain in their natural state, so very limited activity where the perimeter buffer location would be. The perimeter buffer woodlands will be protected by an area that buffers the buffer. That's what we were talking about a minute ago, which we'll highlight in a future slide, by a 20-foot area called the perimeter buffer protection area. That's a term of art that we've developed, and we'll illustrate that in a minute. The buffer is protected, fenced off, and marked during construction, so there will be no accidents. The trees are not going to be affected by someone that's not paying attention and driving heavy
I have a
equipment.
question on that. So I understand these are just general bullets. When that's reduced to an ordinance language, the protection area is going to be 20 feet from where? The drip line or the trunk of the tree, or?
We've got an illustration next to show that, and we'll describe it. We will allow some activities inside the perimeter buffer. For instance, selective clearing, removal of invasive species and dead trees. This is similar language that was used in the resource buffer ordinance. It's what we heard from our resource buffer committee, that you've got to be able to go in and do some things. For instance, if you've got a dead tree that creates a safety issue, you may want to go in and remove that. But that will be assessed by a certified professional. So we'll know what activities should or shouldn't be permitted when it comes to that type of selective clearing. Walking trails, if we're going to have buffers and you want to access the buffers, you should be allowed to access them with walking trails. And then all of our buffers that we're referencing today are going to have a 2-year guarantee. So whether you're the developer or eventually the HOA, you will be required to maintain and keep the perimeter buffer, whether it's existing or planted trees.
Could I suggest maybe changing that to, instead of a 2-year guarantee, to whenever the HOA takes over? So there's a continuity, because if it takes 4 years to complete the project, you got a couple years with failing trees and nobody addressing the situation.
So we talked about this at some length yesterday. And a couple things. One, it's 2 years from substantial completion. That's kind of the county's final sign-off on
So
subdivision.
essentially, it's imminent that HOA is going to.
Yeah, and so in terms of timing, they have to be planted before the first building permit goes in. And this is on existing woodlands, but we're just jumping ahead. But if they're being planted, they'd have to be planted before the first building permit's issued in that phase. And then they figure all the houses are built. That's a couple of years that the trees are established. Then at the end of that process, there's substantial completion by the county, and then it's 2 years. So you're getting up around or maybe even past the HOA. We talked about that, and it's just the county is not, we don't play a role in that transfer to the HOA, so we don't necessarily know when that's happening. And so we thought it was easier to do substantial completion, more trackable, plus 2 years. And it'd probably work out to be about the same.
Are they bonded, the buffers?
They reference the bonding today, and then what we.
So today they're bonded, so before the development gets a notice to proceed, if a buffer is required, it goes with staff, we calculate the bond, we collect the bond, that's all taken care of before the notice to proceed begins for the entire development. And it's envisaged that that would continue, but with more robust language about how bonding is to operate as part of this. So it would be enhanced, is the answer to your question. So.
Vince mentioned timing. Some of these buffers go in July, which is a terrible time to plant trees. Is there any thought, or is it too burdensome to require irrigation? Or?
Well, we're going to tell you what we are suggesting when it comes to the timing of the installation here in a minute. Again, the caveat for this entire presentation is we expect and want to hear from the professional communities, whether it's the forestry community or the engineering community, to give us feedback on some of these ideas. Certainly, with the standards we're putting in place now, the expectation is when you plan, those buffers must grow and survive. If they don't survive, then you're going to be required to come back and plant. So if you need irrigation because you plan in a period where there's no rain, the developer is expected to keep those buffers growing.
And I assume then that 2 years would go with the planting.
Yes.
If something dies, they put a new tree in, that gets 2 years, which is longer than the first part, right?
Does that need to
You
be
started with
specified?
2 years, suppose something dies before that, they got it replanted.
Right.
Does that get 2 years from the replanting?
No, that 2 years is fixed. So
you can replant something, got 2 months left, and it's, okay.
I mean, because at some point too, there's a perpetual maintenance obligation. It shows up on the site plan. It's in our code. You got to keep the trees. At some point when it's turned over to the HOA or whatever, there's not any bonding in there anyway. So that was sort of a finite.
Okay.
Yeah, there's got to be a stopping point.
Yeah, and we tried to look at the stopping point to be consistent with what we do for everything else, like sidewalk inspections, for example.
Exactly.
The buffer is the same 30-foot even if it's near a body of water or not wider near the water?
There's a reference to that in a minute, but to answer your question, if there is a resource that we protect in the other section of code, tidal wetlands or a river stream, that falls under the resource buffer ordinance, the resource buffer ordinance takes precedent first. So, for example, you build on a tidal river and it's a 100-foot buffer,
Right.
you're going to have a 100-foot buffer, not a 130-foot buffer. It's just 100, and resource buffer covers the perimeter buffer.
I still wonder how, there's a development that's off Dorman Road, I think, down that neck, that keeps, every time it rains, like this past weekend again, and I've been looking at this for a year and talking to Jessica, it seems like every time it rains, that it flushes mud into Burton Pond. And, I mean, they've fixed it, and they fix it, and they fix it, or at least purported, they fix it. Mm-hmm. But yet the mud's still going into the pond. So maybe that one was grandfathered before the ordinance was passed, but it's a concern. I mean, it's persistent. I mean, and I don't know how we fix that, but it can't be allowed.
Well, I think that you brought the point up. That topic was dealt with in our resource buffer initiative. So with that in place, and that's fairly robust, and there was a lot of engineering and science that went into that.
Right.
That should be covered. That's really different from this because that deals with a resource where these are just buffers on the boundary of a subdivision.
Is the state aware of our efforts with regard to the resource buffer? Because, we hear these tales of, ideas of 300-foot riparian buffers and things like that, which seem incredibly ill-advised. But do they know what we're doing?
Very limited, very limited. And it's not what we're doing, it's what we already did. And the fact that we took 2+ years to pass an ordinance that came from a committee of...
telegram or something?
It's not for lack of trying. I mean, we've been on conferences where we've talked about this, and we have said, and gone through the description of the initiative and all the stakeholders that were involved in that, that it was public and private, University of Delaware, engineers, environmental folks, property owners, and developers. That was, everything you all know about. And we've sent it to them. I think we've sent it to them several times, so hopefully we'll get some traction. Our initiative, so they realize that we're not just sitting here not doing anything.
Exactly.
If I can add, each year we have to, under the Delaware Code, we have to prepare a report to the State Planning Office each year outlining all the initiatives and activities. We have to send them our data on building permits. And we have shared and announced the results of that initiative, and that goes to the State Planning Office. Beyond that office, I'm not sure how it gets dispersed to all the state agencies, but we did promote the success of that ordinance and that it had moved forward, and that was in our last report. So and again, as we implement that, we again report to them every year. So we do tell at least part of the state.
I will say this, that it seems like the folks that are telling us that we need a better buffer don't realize that we already have a buffer when it comes to resource buffer. And that resource buffer was developed under the work that Vince just referenced. In fact, we've talked to legislators at length and said, have you seen it? It's still on our website. Go look at the page that says, here's hours of work, hours of workshops, minutes, ordinances, PowerPoints, and they don't realize that we've already done it.
And we have a lot of redundancy built in already.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the recommendations we're making on perimeter buffers are coming from the resource buffer work that's already been done. Okay, to Mr. Schaefer's point and what we talked about earlier, buffering the buffer. So this is a picture of an actual development, and it's the same picture we used in the workshop. You can see on the left existing perimeter trees being used for the buffer, okay? And then you can see the silk fence. So in this instance, they put the silk fence up. This is the line currently where you don't want construction activity to go past the silk fence to make sure that the trees are maintained. So in today's world, silk fence in place, trees are maintained. To buffer the buffer, we are recommending a 20-foot separation of the 30-foot buffering area. So you can see here, if in the future this gets approved, the silk fence would move out or to the right by 20 feet. And it would protect the 30-foot of the perimeter buffer, and it would give a 20-foot buffering of the buffer to keep equipment and activity and grading and root impact away from the existing trees. Now, you may ask, why only 20 feet? We've heard from other experts a distance much greater than that, to some degree 5 times that size, right? If you talk to the forestry people. Some people talk about drip line, the canopy of the tree. That's referenced in ordinance as well. Stay away from the drip line. We picked 20 feet because 30 plus 20 equals 50. And 50 feet is called out in our resource buffer ordinance today as a distance that we would protect that resource, a stream or a river. So there's a little bit of consistency baked into this, but there's zero science baked into 20 feet.
That's my question. I mean, it's 20, I don't really care what the number is. It could be 6 feet, you know, as long as it keeps the tree alive.
Right.
And that's the question. We want to keep those trees alive.
And I would tell you, I would want someone with some expertise to give a recommendation, because in my estimation and all the research I've done, the number is bigger than 20. It's going to be larger than that, but that's going to be a decision you all have to be comfortable with. How much protection do these trees need, and how much area are you willing to protect? Because in essence, if we protect 30 plus 20, you're protecting 50 feet that won't have improvements inside of it, but for a little bit of drainage improvements if we allow that. So this is a big question mark moving forward, how we want to buffer the buffers.
We'll keep that on the radar, that number.
This is to be determined, right? And again, we want it to just be consistent. 50 feet is what's in resource buffering. So 50 feet is what we protect, is it river and streams right now? So at least we say we protect the rivers and streams by 50 feet. We can protect a perimeter buffer by 50 feet.
Got another question.
Please.
So it looks like to me that this site was cleared, and the Conservation District probably required that silt fence to be put up there while they were clearing this
Yes.
stuff on the right. So Jamie's going to go out there and tell the developer, once he clears the area he needs to clear, he's got the silt fence up for the Conservation District to meet their requirements, which they're going to want day one, right, before he starts pushing any dirt here. Mm-hmm. He's going to have to put up another silt fence or possibly move that silt fence out, which probably be less expensive to put another one up. Is that?
So it actually, it's a little bit different process than that. Before notice to proceed, they have to go out and mark where the 30 and 20 would be. And that's not a silt fence, it's with ribbons or whatever else, so that everybody knows this is where the line is. And then at that point, they would go in, start clearing, and put the silt fence on the outside of the 50 feet. Because we wanted to get, obviously if you have woods, you can't really put a silt fence in through the woods first before you start doing any work. But we wanted that marked before you start doing it.
Well, I guess he could, if he had to put that silt fence up for the Conservation District requirements while he's clearing out here, he could put an orange construction fence up at the 20 feet.
And the hope is that, let's just imagine that we're using 20 feet as a protection area. One fence goes in at one location, 30 plus 20, and that works for both the district and for us. Hopefully. For two different reasons. Correct. And again, going back to, this is only when there's a buffer in place on the perimeter that they're aiming to protect. By my guess, we're only talking about half the subdivisions that we see that have a perimeter buffer with existing trees. The other half are no trees at all. And if you have no trees at all, you have to plant the trees and create the buffer.
But to Mr. Vincent's point earlier, the silt fencing, that's a question we just need to make sure with SCD that what we're saying is in coordination with what they require on the ground.
Probably jumping ahead again, but timing on planting the buffer, you're going to get to that?
Yep, we're going to get to it.
Yeah.
So, idea, little consistency, no science. Stay tuned. We readily admit a lawyer, an administrator, and your P&Z director are the ones coming up with these ideas based on feedback and some research. But we need your feedback and we need the community's feedback on how to buffer the buffers.
And I appreciate that you're being careful with this.
We don't want to get kicked out of the council chambers on our first outline. So when there's no,
I've got a question.
yeah, please.
So the 20 feet, how does that affect the building envelope of the structure? Does that in the setback?
Well, we'll need to figure that part out, but I guess our recommendation at this stage, if it remains 20 feet, that new line here, this blue line, would be the limitation of disturbance.
And that's where you start your setback.
That's where you start your lot lines.
That's what I meant to say, yeah.
So
I'm sorry.
There'll be no lot lines in that buffer.
Okay.
So that's HOA common.
Yeah.
So his building envelope just shrunk 20 feet.
I wouldn't, that's true, but I wouldn't characterize it that way, because keep in mind, with cluster subdivisions, you have a ton of open space that you can play with and design around. And when you look at subdivisions today, some of them, the lot lines go right at the 30 feet, the existing buffers. But more often than not, it's 30 feet, and then there's open space because the roads curve around and everything else.
So we're going to have to be mindful when we tell them how much contiguous open space they're required to provide, that, well, we're also asking for this.
But remember, the perimeter buffer currently counts as open space,
Right.
and then the open space obviously counts as open space. And if you think about those small lots, like I talked about that mathematical sort of formula that 7,500 square foot lots at 2 an acre is about a third of an acre.
Yeah.
And you're looking at developments that have upwards of 40% open space right now. There's a lot of room to play with in design. Now, that's not every case, but that's, most cases. So.
All right, very simple, back to the two questions, are there woods or are there not woods? Very simple when there are no woodlands, right? You basically have to plant a perimeter. You have to plant the perimeter based on the standards in the landscaping plan that we'll develop. It'll be marked off and protected, and it'll have a 2-year guarantee. So pretty straightforward, right? Now, the one question that's come up already, and I'll skip ahead on our presentation, we are recommending a change that the perimeter buffer goes in first. If you have a blank slate and it's just a farm with no trees, put the perimeter buffer in first. Remember the picture that we showed at the workshop? The houses came around and down the street, and the perimeter buffer is coming up the street, not even corresponding with house construction. So you, as a homeowner, moved into a home and you didn't have a perimeter buffer. Our recommendation is plant the buffer first.
Now, would that 20-foot buffer of the buffer come into play with a new buffer?
It would.
No.
Oh, sorry, not with the new buffers.
Yeah. If they do plant it, it's only if there's existing trees.
Okay, that's what I want to make sure we're clear and have that
Yes,
That's
defined.
before the first permit's issued?
that is correct. So just like you put in your streets, your sewer, your stormwater, drainage, first coat, plant your trees. And if you need to irrigate your trees, irrigate your trees. You've got electricity out to the stormwater pond, you can run electricity over
How do you
to.
determine who determines that and under what conditions? I mean, do we play a role in that
Which part?
if you have to irrigate?
We play a role in the survival of the perimeter buffer. So his team will come out and inspect. It's a phase-by-phase requirement. So phase 1, plant your entire tree buffer. If you're ready to go to phase 2, he inspects phase 1's buffer and makes sure it's up, growing, and surviving, and then you can move to phase 2.
That adds another inspection, Jamie. Do you have the capability of doing that?
We do, because we'll have to go out at commencement anyway to verify that the buffer's in, so there's one inspection. And then we'll have to go in at closeout to verify that the trees have survived, so there's 2 inspections. To note about irrigation, that there are developments in the county that have installed irrigation and still had trees fail, but it is generally beneficial, but it's not always a guarantee, so we would have to inspect with irrigation.
We required that?
No, we didn't require it, but where the developer proffered it to maximise survival of the trees, we supported it. So
It's entirely the developer's call whether they have it.
at the moment, yes, correct, yeah.
And they remain that way, right?
Yeah, and as a practical matter, keep in mind that, if you got to figure out which is more important. We want the trees to go in first before the first building permit's issued, because we wanted them to be there before they start constructing, but we also want them to get them established as early as possible. But if you're having them go in first, there may not actually be irrigation and water available at the time of planting in every
Oh, yeah.
situation too, you know?
You have the
So-
storm pond in.
Yeah, I mean, I
Throw
guess
a
you could probably
sewage
pump.
in there and
Yeah.
pump water.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot less expensive to irrigate than it is to go back and replant dead trees. I mean, that costs a lot of money.
Well, and I would say across the board, what we are seeing now that we're taking a real focused look on this is that the perimeter buffers have just not been a priority. They've been ignored, or until his office calls because a resident calls or because a neighbor calls,
Yes.
the developers aren't really paying attention to it. They plant it and they leave, and the trees live or die, and that's it. We've got to really pay attention now of what's happening on the ground and inspect these perimeter buffers just like we would any other amenity that the development's expected to install.
And we do have the capability of this additional inspection to be able to keep up.
We do, because this new process actually would reduce the number of inspections we're currently undertaking. At the moment, we're undertaking dozens of additional inspections because we receive a complaint. In between, so by having an inspection before the houses start and having an inspection at bond release, it would actually reduce our overall number of inspections.
Okay.
But they would have to be more thorough, final and beginning inspections. So when we get a complaint, we can say, well, look, we'll go out. We'll investigate prior to final completion, and that will reduce the amount of interim inspections we're doing right now.
It's okay.
Would there ever be a circumstance where we are requiring irrigation?
No, not in all cases.
We're not going to touch that. We're not going to.
That's up to you all, but right now, currently, we don't touch that, and that's not.
I'm just asking. I just want to be clear that, is it potentially, a case-by-case basis we ask or demand or require?
It's definitely a benefit, so we can discuss it when folks come in for bonding, but we've seen buffers survive perfectly well without any irrigation.
Right.
And I've seen projects with irrigation where you still have trees not survive. We've had some this year. It really is weather dependent. So
Yeah.
it's.
So the answer is no.
You might be going to hit it later on, but there's something I think, is somewhere in here you're going to reference or talk about where we've seen pictures or issues where people have gone in the buffer behind their home and taken out part of the buffer and made it a picnic area?
Yes.
Or whatever, are we going to,
Well, the signs will take care of that, I guess.
I
So
don't know. I'm just saying, I mean,
Signs on the front end, yeah, and we'll get to it on the back end.
signs are a great start, right? Because I don't think when you move into a house and you see your backyard and you see the woods, you don't know where your property line is.
Yeah.
On a fully established development, right?
Right.
So those pictures we saw, yes, they were on common area ground. Now, by the time they're on that common area ground, it's controlled by the community. So it's up to the community to police that. With signs in place that say community-owned perimeter buffer line, and you look down the line and see it, it's probably going to give you an idea that this means something, and I'm not really allowed to do what we saw in those pictures inside that line. That's the hope, right?
And we haven't gotten this far in the weeds, but one of the things we talked about was having in the code an example of the sign and even reference there may be penalties for violation. Since
Glad
this is-
Doug's not in the room.
So just to move forward in the idea that when there is no trees, this is, again, focus in on Ocean Meadows and Cardinal Grove. That is a subdivision coming up against a subdivision where no trees exist. You can see at the top, nearly completed street of houses, and in certain sections, there is no perimeter buffer that exists. And then below, Cardinal Grove, much further behind in construction, but they have their silk fence in, and they are putting something in place at that stage. Again, our hope is the recommendation, perimeter buffers, when they need to be planted, get planted first. Okay. So you may ask yourself, how do we
what's that noise?
protect woodlands that are in place and going to be used for the perimeter buffer? I think we referenced the bulldozing earlier. Through research, there are jurisdictions that have a look back, and you will go into the property that is proffering a development and look to see what was there 5 years ago. We have that technology that we utilize today that enables us as a county to go back in time and look to see where things stood at 5 years. So the suggestion, this is a new suggestion, is when a development wants to use existing woodlands for a perimeter buffer, we go back 5 years and look to see if the woods were affected through a harvesting of the area where the perimeter buffer was to go. Again, we are only talking about 30 feet. 200 acres of trees, we could care less outside the 30 feet. If you want to talk about a woodlands preservation ordinance, we can talk about that. It's further down your list. But this is just the perimeter buffer. So we look at it 5 years ago. If you've harvested the trees within that 5-year period, we're going to measure the 30 feet of harvested area to come up with a determination of that harvested area. We're going to make you replant the trees at double the density. So 15 trees every 50 feet instead of 15 trees every 100 feet.
Is there a point in time you have too many trees?
Probably.
Survive, will they take over each other?
I guess nature will figure that out.
But now we're talking about can't die.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean,
So, excellent question. More feedback we want to get from forestry people that can tell us 15 trees every 50 feet is absurd. All we did was take our current standard and doubled it.
yeah. I understand the intent. Want to make sure that it's physically possible and makes sense to do.
Right. In addition, again, we're trying to incentivize someone to keep 30 feet of their trees. So we're going to measure how much you cut down. We're going to ask you to double the density of trees to replant the perimeter buffer. And then we're going to ask you to plant or preserve an area double the size of what you've harvested. Okay? In the buffer area. And I'm going to show you a picture that will make this easy to understand.
And I'm one quick. He said we're going to ask you. We're going to tell you. So, that's gonna be,
We're suggesting that it makes its way into your
yeah,
ordinance.
okay. I thought you were talking about to the
Like those
developer.
voluntary
Yeah, the
assessments.
developer, we're telling them
Yes.
about what to do.
If it makes it into the ordinance, we're
Is
asking.
this a voluntary assessment?
What we learned in our resource buffer exercises, you can ask developers to do things on property or off property. So we baked in on number 4, if you want to preserve or plant in a area nearby, we'll keep it within the same HUC 12. Remember that term HUC stands for something in the USGS world. But it's a defined area that is smaller than a zip code, and it tells us that you have to do something within an area nearby the development. So hold tight. Let me show you a picture. Okay, this is an actual development in Sussex County recently. On the right is an existing development, okay? On the left is a development that got approved by the county to build a cluster subdivision. They came in, they clear-cutted all the existing woods. The woods property line between the two developments is indicated here in yellow. The 30-foot buffer, which is required today and maybe required tomorrow, will look like this. What we're telling the developers to determine is the area between these two lines. So this 30 feet is the area harvested, right? And that's the area that we're focused on. So stay tuned to the next picture, which highlights the same thing. We're going to ask you to measure that 30 feet distance between the two because that's been harvested. It's not been protected. The existing trees got knocked down. We're going to tell you to plant double the trees in that 30 feet only. And then we're going to tell you to plant or preserve double the area that was not protected or not kept. So in this example, inside that area, if that was a 1 acre of harvest, we're going to tell you to plant or preserve 2 acres of trees, either on that development or in a HUC 12 nearby.
In addition to
Receiving area somewhere nearby?
Yes. Or on the same development. A lot of times, as Mr. Robertson said, there's 40% open space in these cluster subdivisions. A lot of time that is tree area. If, in fact, you've preserved 2 acres of trees somewhere else on this property, then you've met this goal. But ultimately, our goal is the trees that were harvested are stopped at the green line, not the yellow line. That's the idea.
All right, so you had them replant that 30 feet that they took out.
at double the plantings.
Double the plant. Does the 30 feet start over again outside that green line?
Yep, it's the same buffer. and we would buffer that buffer 20 feet. But all we're offering and asking, or all we're asking is, you've got to plant the trees at double the density, because what we really have asked you to do is keep the trees and stop the bulldozer at the green line instead of
The
the
yellow
yellow.
line is the property line,
Yes.
and they inadvertently or on purpose cleared it to the property line.
Yes.
This is like an attempt at the 5-year look back, I guess, right?
Absolutely. I'm pretty strong on that 5-year look back as a deterrent not to come in and clear cut 5 years prior to your application being submitted.
So that's
I'm
different.
pretty
I mean,
hard and
that's-
fast on that because that's a deterrent for people not to go in there and clear cut to the property line.
So in your case, the penalty is you got to put back double. In his case, the penalty is you don't get to build anything for 5 years. Is that right?
I don't know that, I wasn't, I'll let Mr. Hudson speak to what his idea is. Our idea is what you said.
Okay.
Replant the perimeter. So you have to plant the 30 feet anyway, right? We're going to require a buffer. So 30 feet planting stands. What we're also asking you to do is take the area you've harvested, double it, and preserve it or plant it somewhere else in the development or in a Huck 12. So we're recreating the trees that, but for your bulldozer, would have stayed in place as an incentive to just stop the bulldozer at the green line, not the yellow line.
And as I said, plant double the plantings in that bulldozed area.
Which is different than what you're saying is.
I'm saying that if someone has a piece of property with the intention of a community, putting a development in it, that if they own the property and they clear cut this with the intention of putting a development, I think that they need to wait, penalize them 5 years that they can't do the development if they go in and clear cut prior to their application. Am I explaining that right?
No, I follow you. That's not what we're recommending. That will be a county council decision if that's what they want to follow the Hudson
So
rule.
that puts the entire development on ice.
The entire piece of property on
This
ice.
says, yeah. This says you can do it, but you're going to have a penalty.
But I think it makes less than scrupulous people. It kind of stops that from being clear cut, knowing full well that a development's going in there, but they're clear cutting it. It's kind of like a bypass.
I just don't know how we would know that they would know, that a development.
That's a good point, yeah.
I mean, and you think of like situations where it's an actual timber, we're talking about harvesting. We're really talking
And I don't
about
want
cutting trees.
I don't want to stop people from being able to timber their land.
Yeah, right. That's why what we propose is different from that. Because it would put, as Mr. Riley said, it would put a property on ice for 5 years, no matter, what the circumstances or who owned the property,
Maybe what I'm thinking is incorrect then.
No, there's jurisdictions that do that. There are jurisdictions. Now, we've entered into the woodland preservation conversation now because we're outside the 30 feet. But there are absolutely jurisdictions that have lookbacks on woodland preservation.
But I don't want to stop someone from the ability from timbering their land.
Well, if that's the case, then if you're okay with them timbering their land up to the green line, then we're on the same page. That's our recommendation.
Okay, I could live with that.
2 questions here.
Mr. Schaefer had a question, go ahead.
So you said that this example was an approved subdivision, and he cut that in between the yellow and the green.
That's correct.
Okay, what if he cut that prior to it being approved? Would this then still kick, going back to Mr. Hudson's comment, this doesn't kick in, right?
So what
If he cut that and then came in with his application, in today's world, it wouldn't apply, right?
today's world, it does not apply for sure.
No.
In our recommendation, if you came in January 1 of this year and asked to have a subdivision and you harvested that property 5 years before that,
or anybody did.
anyone did. If the woods got cut down 5 years before that, then this kicks in.
But if he got his subdivision approved, and then he cut that and said, oh, I made a mistake, he would be required to plant that 30 feet.
We have a mistake section in here, yes. I think we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
Just want to understand in my mind, so I understand about the 30 feet, he's cut that out. Explain to me so I understand that if that happened, they got to put back twice as many trees in that 30 feet. And then they got to put more trees somewhere else.
Or preserve existing trees somewhere else.
So we're going to penalize them twice.
Correct. So penalize them once by saying we want a more dense, the thought is the perimeter buffer will come back with more trees and create a buffer quicker and bigger. And then secondly, you knock down all the trees, you should go out and plant or preserve trees in some area, that development or in the same area as a HUC 12. Again, with the incentive of trying to save the trees on the front end.
I think of it as a carrot, not a stick, you know?
I'm better with a stick.
So if you really want to get into the weeds, so you let them do a receiving area for this planting of the double.
Yes.
He destroyed an acre, he's got to replant 2 acres. Let's say he decides to do that in a receiving area off-site. Who's going to approve the receiving area, and who's going to police it that he doesn't go out there and bulldoze the receiving area 6 months later?
We are, the county, and this is in the resource buffer ordinance that was approved. They have to record a conservation easement to the benefit of the county, which would be recorded downstairs, and then in essence, we would.
Perpetuity?
In perpetuity, yes.
And that's in the resource buffer. If it's on site, it'll be on the site plan, so that's how it's.
I want to quickly illustrate one example of what we talked about.
That's not in here, is it?
That is not in here. This is just because I know there's a fear that we're saying that we're asking developers not to cut down the trees. This is a development. This is what it looked like 2 years ago, all trees. This is what it looked like after the developer asked to have the trees harvested.
If you look at it today, most of that's underwater.
There was a rainstorm this weekend. Mr. Riley's seen pictures. Okay. You can see along the edge here, this is the property line between adjoining properties. This property line actually goes all the way back here and forms this triangle, goes around this property, and then keeps going around. And there were some strips of trees that were preserved. Remember, we're asking, in one example, double the trees to be kept and preserved. This development is preserving all of these trees in the back, which, just as a farmer's eye, is 5 acres or more, okay? We asked our engineering consultant to calculate 30-foot strip all the way around the subdivision to get an acreage. They did the calculation on the right-hand side. The green strip is 30 feet all the way around, including the frontage road, which really doesn't count.